Living on the ground floor in a city like Chicago requires a specific kind of paranoia. It's not just about safety, it's about visibility. When your living room window is exactly 4 feet from a busy public sidewalk, you stop looking at the view and start worrying about who is looking at you. I moved into the apartment on Milwaukee Avenue 3 years and 2 months ago. It's a pre-war building, sturdy but settling, with high ceilings and drafty windows. The rent was cheap because of the location, right next to a street lamp that buzzes like an angry hornet and bathes the entire front room in a sickly, sodium vapor orange glow every night. To combat this, I did what anyone in my position would do. I turned my apartment into a bunker. I bought the heaviest, most expensive blackout curtains I could find online. They aren't the cheap paper-thin ones from Target. These are industrial-grade, navy blue velvet thermal insulated drapes that weigh about 15 pounds per panel. I installed a reinforced steel rod just to hold them up. When I pull them shut, they hit the floor with a satisfying heavy thud, effectively sealing off the outside world. For 3 years, I had a system. I leave for work at 8:30 a.m. and I close the curtains. I come home at 6 p.m. and the curtains stay closed. I don't open them for sunlight. I don't open them to check the weather. In my mind, that window doesn't exist. It's just a wall of blue velvet. It might sound excessive, but it gave me a sense of control. Inside, it was my space. Outside, it was the noise, the drunks stumbling home from the bars, and the constant traffic. The curtains were the barrier between my sanctuary and the chaos. That barrier held up perfectly until last Tuesday. It was October 14th. I had stayed late at the office to finish a project and didn't get back to my building until 11:47 p.m. I remember checking my watch because I was annoyed that the corner bodega was already closed. I was tired, my eyes were stinging from staring at screens all day, and I just wanted to collapse. I unlocked my front door, tossed my keys into the ceramic bowl on the entry table, and walked into the living room to turn on the lamp. The room was dark, obviously, but the street lamp outside is usually bright enough that even with the blackout curtains, there's a faint, diffused halo around the edges of the window frame. But that night, the light wasn't just bleeding around the edges. I stopped in the middle of the room, my hand hovering over the lamp switch. A distinct, sharp beam of orange light was slicing across my rug. I stood frozen, staring at that line of light. It was cutting through the darkness of my living room like a laser, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. My blackout curtains weren't just slightly askew, they were parted. It was a perfect, vertical slit, exactly in the center of the window. The gap was about 3 inches wide at eye level, tapering off toward the top and bottom. It didn't look like the wind had blown them open. The heavy velvet was too dense for a draft to move it that precisely. It looked exactly like someone had gripped the inner edges of the fabric, pulled them apart to peek outside, and then simply walked away without closing them back up. My heart did a painful double thump against my ribs. My first instinct wasn't ghosts, it was intruders. I didn't move toward the window immediately. I backed up slowly into the kitchen, grabbed the longest knife from the butcher block, a 10-inch chef's knife, and then did a sweep of the apartment. Bathroom, bedroom, coat closet. I even checked under my bed, feeling ridiculous as I lay on the cold hardwood floor, peering into the dust bunnies. The apartment was empty. The front door had been double locked when I arrived. The windows are painted shut. I know because I tried to open them last summer during a heat wave and gave up after 20 minutes of prying. Okay, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded thin and weak in the empty room. It's just the heater. It was a flimsy explanation, but I forced myself to buy it. The radiator sits right below that window. I told myself the heat rising must have created an updraft, maybe ballooning the fabric enough to separate the magnetic weights at the bottom. Or maybe I had been careless this morning. Maybe I was so tired I hadn't pulled them completely flush before leaving. I walked over to the window to fix it. Standing there, bathed in that slice of orange street lamp glow, I felt incredibly exposed. If anyone was walking by outside, I was just a dark silhouette against the interior of my apartment. I reached out to grab the fabric. The velvet felt cold. Not room temperature cool, but cold, like it had been absorbing the chill from the glass for hours. I grabbed both panels and yanked them together hard. The heavy fabric swished and collided, overlapping by a good 4 inches. I smoothed down the folds, making sure the seal was tight. I even tugged on the bottom hems to ensure they were weighted down properly. Fixed, I muttered. I put the knife back in the kitchen, washed my face, and tried to wind down. But as I lay in bed, staring at my ceiling fan, I couldn't shake a specific, nagging image. When I had looked closely at the gap, the fabric on the left panel wasn't just moved, it was crumpled, right at head height. The velvet pile was crushed in a way that looked suspiciously like the impression of a fist, like someone had been clutching it tightly for a long time. I rolled over and pulled the duvet up to my chin. Old fabric, I told myself. Just old fabric losing its shape. For the next 2 days, I checked the curtains obsessively. Every time I walked past the living room, I'd stop and stare, waiting for them to move. But they hung there, heavy and motionless, just a wall of dark blue velvet. I started to relax. The incident with the knife felt melodramatic in hindsight, just a tired brain misinterpreting a draft. That changed on Thursday evening. I was down in the foyer grabbing my mail. It was 6:15 p.m. I was flipping through a stack of bills when the front door opened, and Mrs. Higgins walked in with her pug, Barnaby. Mrs. Higgins lives in Unit 1B, directly across the hall from me. She's a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who smokes slim menthols and knows everything that happens in our building before the landlord does. Usually, she greets me with a complaint about the recycling bins or the weather. This time, she stopped dead in the doorway. She pulled Barnaby's leash tight, keeping the dog close to her legs. She didn't say hello. She just stared at me, her eyes narrowing behind her thick glasses. "You all right, Michael?" she asked. Her voice was guarded, lacking its usual rasp of familiarity. "I'm fine," I said, confused. "Long week." "You?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me, then glanced at my hands, then back up to my face, as if checking for something. "You seemed unwell last night, or maybe just odd." I didn't want to say anything, but it spooked Barnaby. I frowned, lowering the mail. "What are you talking about? I was in bed by 11 last night." Mrs. Higgins let out a short, dry laugh that sounded entirely devoid of humor. "Don't pull my leg, Mike. I was out here at 3:15 a.m. Barnaby had an upset stomach. I was standing right there on the sidewalk, under the lamp." She pointed a gloved finger toward the street. "I saw you," she continued, her voice dropping to a hush. "Standing at your window. You had those thick curtains pulled apart just a crack, maybe 2 or 3 inches, just enough to fit your face." A cold prickle of sweat broke out on my lower back. "Mrs. Higgins, I swear to you, I was asleep. I didn't wake up until my alarm went off at 7. She stared at me for a long, uncomfortable silence. The hallway seemed to stretch, the buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead suddenly sounding like a scream. The color began to drain from her face, leaving her rouge standing out starkly against her pale skin. "If you were asleep," she whispered, taking a half step back toward the door, "then who was standing in your living room?" I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry. "It was pressing its face right against the glass," she said, her voice trembling now, white as a sheet. "And it was smiling. Michael, it was smiling so wide I could see teeth." I waved because I thought it was you playing a joke, but it didn't move. It just kept grinning at me through that little gap. She yanked Barnaby toward the stairs, not looking at me again. "Check your locks, kid." That wasn't right. That wasn't right at all. I stood alone in the foyer, clutching my mail so hard I crumpled the envelopes. 3:15 a.m. I had been fast asleep in my bedroom, with the door closed. My bedroom is at the back of the apartment. To get to the living room window, you have to walk down the hallway, past the bathroom, and through the kitchen. Someone or something had been standing in my living room for who knows how long, parting my curtains, and smiling at my neighbors while I slept 50 feet away. I didn't sleep that night. I dragged a heavy armchair from the corner, wedged it under the doorknob of my front door. Then I sat in my kitchen with a baseball bat across my lap until the sun came up. Every time the refrigerator hummed or a floorboard settled, my grip tightened on the bat handle until my knuckles turned white. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no rustling fabric, just the oppressive silence of a lonely apartment at 4 a.m. By Friday morning, exhaustion was making me feel heavy and sluggish, like I was moving through water. The terror from Mrs. Higgins' story had dulled into a grim, aching anxiety. I tried to rationalize it again. Mrs. Higgins is old. She has cataracts. Maybe she saw a reflection. Maybe she saw a burglar who picked my lock and left without taking anything. Unlikely, but better than the alternative. I was drinking a cup of stale coffee, standing in the doorway of the living room, when I saw it. The gap was back. It was identical to the first time. a precise 3-inch vertical slit in the center of the navy velvet. The morning light was gray and weak, filtering through the opening like a dirty ribbon. I felt a surge of anger override the fear. I slammed my coffee cup down on the counter, splashing hot liquid over my hand, and marched across the room. I was done with this. I was going to buy duct tape and seal the damn thing shut. I reached out to grab the panels, intending to rip them closed, but my hand froze inches from the fabric. The morning light was hitting the window pane at a specific angle, illuminating the dust on the glass. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see the window. Clearly, there was a mark on the glass. It wasn't a streak or a scratch. It was a smudge, a large, greasy oval, roughly the size of a grapefruit. I leaned in closer, my breath hitching in my throat. The texture of the smudge was distinct, oily, and detailed. I could see the ridges of skin pores. I could see the faint impression of a hairline at the top. It was a forehead print. Someone had pressed their forehead against the glass with significant force, holding it there long enough to leave a heavy residue of oil. My stomach dropped. I reached out a shaking finger and touched the glass. The smear wiped away easily. It was on the inside. I stepped back, my legs feeling like they were about to give out. I'm 5'10". I stood directly in front of the smudge. The print was positioned near the top of the window frame. I raised my hand. I had to reach up to touch it. Whoever or whatever had stood there, pressing their forehead against the glass to look out at Mrs. Higgins, was at least 7 feet tall. And they had been inside my apartment, standing between the curtains and the window, waiting. The realization that something 7 feet tall had been in my apartment sent me into a frantic, hyper-focused state of panic. I didn't go to work. I called out, feigning a family emergency, and spent the next 3 hours tearing my apartment apart. I checked every closet. I opened the utility panel in the hallway. I even unscrewed the vent covers and shined a flashlight into the dusty ducts. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. The windows were still painted shut. I even chipped a fingernail trying to pry one open just to be sure. The front door deadbolt was secure. There was simply no way for anyone to get in. And yet, the forehead print was there, mocking me with its impossible height. I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. I couldn't trust my eyes anymore, and I certainly couldn't trust Mrs. Higgins' testimony. I needed to know if this was happening when I wasn't looking, or if I was losing my mind. I went to the hardware store and bought a fresh roll of clear packing tape, the heavy-duty kind used for shipping boxes. Around 4 p.m., I enacted my plan. It was simple but foolproof. I pulled the velvet curtains shut, making sure they overlapped significantly in the center. I took a 6-inch strip of the packing tape and applied it horizontally across the seam where the two panels met. I pressed it down hard, using my thumbnail to burnish it into the velvet piles so it wouldn't just peel off on its own. If the curtains were just settling, or if a draft was blowing them, the tape would hold. It was strong enough to resist a breeze. But if someone physically grabbed those panels and pulled them apart to look outside, the tape would buckle, twist, or tear. I didn't stop there. I took a small piece of paper, a receipt from the hardware store, and balanced it on the very top of the curtain rod, right in the middle. If the rod was jostled or the curtains were slid aggressively, the paper would fall. "Your move," I whispered to the empty room. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment. I couldn't stay there. I needed to clear my head. I walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away and sat there for hours, staring at my phone but not reading anything. I was just watching the clock. I felt like a child playing a game of chicken with a monster under the bed, except I was 26, and the monster was leaving greasy prints on my windows. At 7:30 p.m., the sun had fully set. The streetlights were flickering on. It was time to go back. The walk home felt like a funeral march. Every shadow looked too long. Every passerby seemed to be watching me. When I reached my building, I paused outside. The orange street lamp was buzzing, its usual angry tune. I looked up at my window. From the street, the curtains looked closed, a solid wall of darkness. I unlocked the front door of the building, walked down the hallway, and stood in front of my apartment door. My hand was shaking so badly, it took me 3 tries to get the key into the lock. I turned the key. Click. I pushed the door open and stepped into the pitch-black foyer. The air inside felt different. Stale. Charged. Like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, when the static makes the hair on your arms stand up. I didn't turn on the light immediately. I just listened. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. I reached for the switch and flicked it on. I stood in the entryway, the overhead light casting harsh shadows against the walls. At first glance, the living room looked exactly how I'd left it. The curtains were drawn. The blue velvet hung all the way to the floor, motionless. For a split second, relief washed over me. It was so intense it made my knees weak. See? I thought. You're crazy.
Relax.
It was a draft. The tape held. But then, I took a step closer. The relief evaporated, replaced by a cold crawling sensation that started at the base of my neck and spread down my spine. The packing tape was still there, bridging the gap between the two panels. But it wasn't flat anymore. When I had applied it, I had been meticulous. I'd smoothed it down so it was perfectly flush against the nap of the velvet. Now, the tape was a mangled, crinkled mess. It was twisted in the middle, creating a chaotic web of air bubbles and creases. I walked right up to it, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The tape hadn't just popped loose from strain, it had been peeled back. I could see the distinct, jagged white lines where the adhesive had been ripped away from the fabric fibers. But the terrifying part wasn't that it had been opened, it was that it had been put back. Something had peeled the tape back to open the curtains, looked out, and then tried to stick it back together. It was done clumsily, like a child trying to fix a broken vase before their parents get home. The ends were misaligned. One side was bunched up, sticking to itself. It was a crude, desperate attempt at camouflage. I looked down at the floor. The small hardware store receipt I'd balanced on the rod was lying on the rug, 3 feet away from the window. It hadn't just fluttered down. It looked like it had been flung. The air in the room felt wrong. It was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of ozone. That sharp, electric scent you get right after a lightning strike. It felt like walking through static electricity. The hair on my arms was standing straight up, not from cold, but from sheer proximity to something. I reached out and touched the tape. It was still warm. Not warm from the sun, it was night. Warm from friction. Or touch. Hello? I croaked. It was a stupid thing to say. Silence answered me. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was a holding its breath silence. I realized then that my little test hadn't just proven I wasn't crazy. It had communicated something to the intruder. I had told it that I knew, and instead of leaving, it had tried badly to deceive me. It was playing along. I backed away from the window slowly, unable to take my eyes off that crinkled, abused strip of plastic. I felt a sudden, violent urge to vomit. I wasn't alone in the apartment. I couldn't see it, but the pressure in the room was undeniable. It felt like the air had been displaced by something massive, something that was currently very, very still. I should have left. Any rational person would have grabbed their wallet, walked out that door, and checked into a Motel 6 for the night. But fear does strange things to your logic centers. It doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it nails your feet to the floor. I felt a desperate, gnawing need to see it. I needed to know what was sharing my space. If I left now, I'd never come back. I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. I locked the front door. I deadbolted it and engaged the chain. Then, I turned off every single light in the apartment. My kitchen is a galley style that opens into the living room through a wide archway. If I sat at the far end, near the refrigerator, I would be shrouded in total darkness, but I'd have a direct line of sight to the living room windows. I dragged a wooden stool into the corner, grabbed the chef's knife I'd used earlier, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the handle, and I sat down. 9 p.m. passed. Then 10 p.m. The apartment settled into the night. Usually these sounds are comforting, the rhythmic clunk hiss of the steam radiator, the hum of the refrigerator compressor, the occasional muffled bass of a car driving by outside. Tonight, every sound was a threat. The radiator pipes groaning sounded like footsteps. The wind rattling the pane sounded like fingers tapping. My eyes adjusted to the dark. The living room was a landscape of shadows. The only light came from the orange street lamp outside, leaking around the edges of the curtains and casting a faint, sickly glow on the floor. The curtains themselves remained a solid, black wall. The tape I had applied was invisible from this distance, just a darker patch on the dark fabric. By 1 a.m., my legs were cramping. My eyes felt dry and gritty from refusing to blink. Doubt started to creep in. Maybe the tape had just popped off. Maybe I was sitting in the dark like a lunatic, armed with kitchen cutlery, waiting for a draft of wind. 2 a.m. The silence was absolute. The city outside had gone to sleep. I was beginning to feel foolish. I relaxed my grip on the knife, flexing my stiff fingers. Then came 2:47 a.m. I know the time because I had just glanced at the microwave clock, the green numbers glowing eerily in the black kitchen. As I looked back toward the living room, the sound tore through the silence. Swish. It wasn't the wind. It was the unmistakable, heavy friction of velvet sliding against a metal rod. It was slow, deliberate, and wet-sounding, like the fabric was heavy with moisture. My breath hitched in my throat, freezing in my lungs. I pressed my back harder against the refrigerator, trying to merge with the appliance. From the darkness of the kitchen, I watched. The sound came again. Shh, clack. The sound of a curtain ring hitting the center support bracket. The curtains were moving. They weren't billowing out. They were sliding apart. The gap in the center, the one I had taped shut, was widening. The tape must have given way silently hours ago, or perhaps it was being severed right now. Inch by inch, the orange light from the street began to invade the room. A vertical line of illumination appeared, growing wider. 3 inches. 4 inches. I gripped the knife with both hands, raising it to my chest. I waited to see a hand. I waited to see a burglar in a ski mask. I waited to see anything human, but no hand appeared to pull the fabric. The curtains were being pushed apart from behind. I watched, my lungs burning from holding my breath, as the physics of the room broke down. Normally, when you open curtains, you grab the edge and pull it toward you, or slide it sideways. That's not what was happening. The fabric was bulging outward, into the living room. Something was pressing against the velvet from the window side, acting like a wedge to force the panels apart. The gap widened to about 6 inches, creating a sharp, structural V-shape of light. The orange glow from the street lamp flooded through, backlighting the intruder. And that's when my brain short-circuited. There is almost no space between my curtains and the window pane. Maybe 4 inches of clearance for the radiator heat to rise. A human being cannot fit there. A child cannot fit there. But something was there. Through the widening V-shape, I saw it. A limb, if you could call it that, was pressed against the glass. It wasn't a hand. It was a pale, tubular segment of flesh, devoid of hair or muscle definition, looking more like uncooked dough than skin. It was impossibly long, stretching down from the top of the window frame to the sill. It was pressing against the fabric, holding the curtains open with a slow, trembling tension. Then, the rest of it shifted into view. A silhouette blocked out the orange street lamp. It was pressed flat against the glass, compressed into that impossible 4-inch space like a specimen between microscope slides. It was facing the street. I could see the side profile of its head. It was wrong. All wrong. The skull was elongated, stretching backward like a gourd. The nose was flattened against the window pane, smeared sideways. And the jaw hung unnaturally low, resting on the clavicle. It was watching the street. It was doing exactly what Mrs. Higgins had said. It was standing in the impossible gap, staring out at the empty sidewalk, waiting for a passerby to torment. My grip on the knife was so tight my fingers were numb. I wanted to scream, to run, to throw the knife, but I was paralyzed by a primal lizard brain terror that told me, if you move, it will hear you. The thing shifted. I heard the wet squeak of skin sliding against glass. The long, doughy limb repositioned itself on the velvet, pushing the gap wider. I realized with a jolt of nausea that the smudge I had seen earlier wasn't from a forehead. It was from that flattened, distended face, pressing against the cold glass for hours at a time. I sat in the dark kitchen, a statue of fear, watching a monster perform its nightly ritual in my living room. I prayed it would stay focused on the street. I prayed it was just a watcher. But then, the pattern broke. Outside, a car drove by, its headlights sweeping across the front of the building. The flash of light seemed to startle it. The silhouette stiffened. The long, pale limb retracted from the velvet, letting the curtain fall partially closed again. But it didn't disappear. It didn't fade away. The shadow behind the curtain shifted. It rotated. The silhouette against the glass vanished. For a heartbeat, I thought it had gone. I thought it had dematerialized or slipped back out through whatever crack it had slithered in from. But then the curtain moved again. This time, it didn't slide along the rod. It billowed outward, directly toward me. The heavy navy velvet, which usually hangs in stiff vertical pleats, was suddenly being sculpted from the inside. Something was pushing against the fabric, testing the resistance. A shape began to form in the relief of the cloth. A shoulder, jagged and too high up. Then a head. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me as I sat crouched in the dark kitchen. My brain had been desperately trying to categorize this as a break-in, a burglar, a creep, someone who had pried the window open from the alleyway. But as I watched that shape press against the velvet, the logic of the room came crashing down on me. The window behind those curtains is a single pane of double-strength glass. It is painted shut with 5 layers of landlord white gloss. I have tried to open it, it's fused solid. Even if someone could open it, there is no ledge outside. The brick wall is flush. To stand outside that window, you would need a ladder or to be hovering 6 feet in the air. And the glass hadn't broken. I would have heard it. The cold, hard truth settled in my stomach like lead. The thing wasn't standing on a ledge outside. It wasn't squeezing through a broken pane. It was standing on my floor. It was standing on the hardwood, inside my apartment, squeezed into the 4-inch gap between the radiator and the window, which meant it hadn't come from outside. I looked at the locked front door. I looked at the sealed vents. The only way for something that size to be behind the curtains was if it had walked across my living room floor, stepped over the radiator, and slipped behind the drapes while I was at work, or while I was in the bathroom, or while I was asleep. It had been inside with me the whole time. The bunker I had built to keep the world out hadn't protected me. It had just given the thing a place to hide. I had created a dark, private closet for it. Right in the center of my home, the shape under the velvet shifted again. The head turned. It wasn't facing the window anymore. It wasn't facing the street. The distinct, protruded outline of a face pressed into the fabric, stretching the velvet tight. I could see the hollows of the eyes. I could see the ridge of a nose bone. It was facing the kitchen. It knew I was there. It wasn't performing for the neighbors anymore. It had turned around, and it was looking through the cloth, straight into the darkness where I was hiding. The silence stretched so tight I thought it would snap my eardrums. The face pressed against the velvet remained motionless for 5 seconds. 5 seconds that felt like hours before the fabric began to tremble. A hand emerged from the central gap. It was the same pale, doughy limb I had seen against the glass, but seeing it in the open air, unshielded by the window, was infinitely worse. It gripped the edge of the navy curtain with long, multi-jointed fingers. The nails were yellow and thick, curling inward like talons. With a wet tearing sound, it ripped the curtains open. The metal rings shrieked against the rod as the heavy drapes were flung aside. The orange light from the street lamp exploded into the room, illuminating the thing that had been sharing my home. It unfolded. That's the only way I can describe it. It didn't just step out. It uncoiled from the tight space like a compressed spring released from a box. It was tall, too tall for the room. Its head scraped against the white popcorn ceiling, forcing it to hunch over. Its skin was the color of curdled milk, glistening with a thin sheen of moisture that caught the street lamp's glow. It wore no clothes, but it possessed no discernible anatomy, no ribs, no navel, just a smooth, pale torso that looked like molded plastic. But the face. God, the face. It turned its head toward the kitchen, the neck twisting with a dry crack. The features were smeared and flattened, permanently distorted from pressing against the glass for so long. The nose was pushed to the side. The forehead was broad and flat, and the eyes were wide, black discs, entirely devoid of whites, set too far apart on the skull. It saw me. I was sitting in the shadows, 30 feet away, but those black eyes locked onto me instantly. Then, it smiled. Mrs. Higgins hadn't exaggerated. The mouth split open way too wide, revealing rows of small, translucent teeth that looked like needle points. It wasn't a smile of greeting. It was a smile of recognition. It looked delighted. It looked hungry. The chef's knife in my hand suddenly felt like a toothpick. My brain, which had been frozen in analysis mode, finally kicked into survival gear. The primal part of my mind screamed a single instruction. Run. The thing took a step forward. Its foot slapped wetly against the hardwood floor. It moved with a jerky, twitchy momentum, its long arms swinging low near its knees. No, I whispered, the sound barely escaping my throat. It tilted its head, the smile widening, and took another step. Faster this time. It wasn't walking, it was closing the distance. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I threw the heavy knife as hard as I could into the darkness of the living room, not aiming, just trying to create a barrier, and I scrambled backward off the stool. The knife clattered uselessly against the floorboards, nowhere near it. The thing let out a sound, a low, chittering wheeze that sounded like air escaping a puncture wound, and lunged. I didn't wait to see how fast it could move. I didn't wait to see if it had claws or weapons. The moment that thing lunged, instinct took the wheel. I kicked the stool backward into the archway, hoping to buy myself a fraction of a second, and scrambled toward the hallway. My socks slipped on the polished hardwood, sending me careening shoulder first into the wall, but the shot of pain barely registered. Behind me, the sound was nightmare fuel. It wasn't the heavy thud of human footsteps. It was a chaotic, wet slapping sound, like raw meat being thrown against the floor, accompanied by the shriek of its nails dragging across the floorboards. It was moving on all fours. And it was fast. I sprinted down the narrow hallway toward the foyer. The distance is maybe 20 feet, but it felt like miles. I could hear the thing breathing, a rattling, wet intake of air that sounded right behind my ear. The smell hit me then, overpowering the ozone scent. It smelled like stagnant pond water and old copper. I reached the front door and slammed my body against it. Panic makes you clumsy. I had double-locked the door. The deadbolt was thrown, and the chain was engaged. I fumbled with the deadbolt, twisting the latch so hard I nearly broke my thumb. Click. That was the easy part. The chain was tight. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't get the metal nub into the slide. "Come on, come on, come on!" I screamed, tears blurring my vision. Behind me, the wet slapping sound stopped. There was a pause. A heavy, shifting silence. I risked a glance over my shoulder. At the end of the hallway, bathed in the dim light spilling from the living room, the thing had stopped. It was crouched on the floor, its limbs splayed out like a spider. Its head was cocked to the side, watching me struggle with the door. It was savoring the panic. It knew I was trapped. Then it sprang. It didn't run. It launched itself through the air, covering the distance in a single, fluid motion. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and finally jammed the chain slider to the open position. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the hallway of the building, just as a heavy weight slammed into the wood from the inside. I didn't look back. I didn't close the door gently. I slammed it shut and ran. I ran out the building's front entrance, barefoot and panting, into the cold October night. I didn't stop at the sidewalk. I ran down the center of Milwaukee Avenue, ignoring the honking horns of late-night taxis. I didn't stop until I saw the fluorescent open sign of the 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. I burst through the diner doors, looking like a lunatic. No shoes, wild eyes, chest heaving. The waitress behind the counter dropped a stack of napkins. "Honey, you okay?" she asked, stepping back. I couldn't speak. I collapsed into the nearest booth, my legs turning to jelly. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I pointed a trembling finger at the landline phone behind the counter. "Police," I wheezed, tasting bile and metal in my throat. "Call the police." I stared out the diner window at the dark street, expecting to see that pale, elongated shape loping toward me under the streetlights. But the street was empty. My hands were clutching the edge of the table so hard my fingernails were digging into the laminate. I was safe. I was out. But as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, hollow shock, I realized something that made me start crying right there in the booth. When I had looked back in the hallway, right before it jumped, when it wasn't just smiling, it was laughing. A silent, heaving, convulsing of its chest. It let me win the race to the door. The police arrived at the diner 6 minutes later. 2 officers, looking tired and skeptical, took my statement while the waitress poured me fresh coffee that I couldn't drink because my hands were shaking too violently to lift the cup. When we went back to the apartment, guns drawn, the front door was standing wide open. The hallway was empty. The apartment was silent. The officers swept the place in under 2 minutes. "Clear," one of them shouted. I stood in the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold. The scene inside looked like a bomb had gone off, but specifically focused on one area. The heavy velvet curtains, my expensive light-blocking sanctuary, were shredded. They hung in tatters from the bent steel rod, looking like strips of flayed skin. But it was the window that made the officers stop and scratch their heads. The double-pane glass was shattered, not cracked, obliterated, and the shards weren't on the rug. They were scattered across the sidewalk outside. Whatever had been in there hadn't used the door to leave. It had smashed its way out, through the painted shut frame and the double-strength glass with enough force to send debris halfway into the street. Looks like he exited through the window, Officer Miller noted, shining his flashlight on the jagged teeth of glass remaining in the frame. But how the hell did he get in? No signs of forced entry on the door. Window was painted shut until 5 minutes ago. They filed a report for a break-in. They suggested it was a junkie looking for quick cash who got spooked. They ignored Mrs. Higgins when she came out in her bathrobe, hysterical, telling them about the long man she'd seen smiling from the window for days. They wrote her off as a confused senior citizen. I didn't argue with them. I didn't tell them about the pale skin or the needle teeth. I just signed the paperwork, grabbed my wallet and my laptop, and left. I left my clothes, my furniture, and my books. I never went back inside to pack. I broke my lease the next morning. I lost my security deposit and had to pay 2 months' rent as a penalty. It cost me nearly $4,000 to walk away from that apartment. It was the best money I ever spent. I live in a 4th floor walk-up in Rogers Park now. It's a small studio, barely big enough for a bed, but it has one feature I insisted on: blinds. Cheap, plastic, horizontal blinds that snap shut and lock into place. No fabric, no folds, no place for anything to stand behind them. I've tried to move on. I go to therapy. I tell myself it was a one-time thing, a freak occurrence, an anomaly, but the trauma has rewired my brain. I can't walk down the street at night anymore. If I do, I find my eyes automatically scanning the windows of the houses I pass. I look for the curtains. I look for that heavy, dark fabric drawn tight against the cold. And specifically, I look for the gap. You know the one. That small vertical slit in the center where the panels don't quite meet. The little triangle of darkness at the bottom where the magnets fail to connect. Most people think that gap is just a nuisance that lets in a sliver of morning light. But I know what it really is. It's not a mistake. It's a peephole. Last week, walking home from the train, I saw a brownstone with dark green drapes. There was a 3-inch gap in the center, and for a split second before I looked away, I saw something pale press against the glass. I didn't stop to check if it was a reflection. I ran. So, take a look at your windows tonight. Check your curtains. If there's a gap, don't go over and close it. Don't touch the fabric. Just leave the room, lock the door, and pray that whatever's looking in is looking from the outside.